It was a warm afternoon, the kind of day when the sun makes the road shimmer and the town seemed quieter than usual. Cars moved lazily through the streets, and people walked slowly, enjoying the calm. A motorcycle could be heard in the distance, its old engine humming steadily. On that bike rode a man who looked ordinary at first glance. His clothes were plain, his face calm, and there was nothing loud or flashy about him. He was just passing through, heading somewhere without attracting attention. Two local police officers sat in their car near the corner of the main street. They had been watching the traffic for some time, but it had been a slow day. When the motorcycle passed by, one of them narrowed his eyes. The bike looked old and the rider seemed too quiet, almost too disciplined in the way he sat straight and steady on the seat. Something about him didn't match the usual picture of a man on such a machine. Without much thought, the officers turned on their lights and signaled for the rider to stop. The man pulled over calmly. He didn't argue or speed away. He simply brought the bike to the side of the road, rested one boot on the ground, and waited. His expression was unreadable. As the officer stepped out of the car, people nearby turned their heads. In small towns, any stop by the police always drew curious eyes. A few shopkeepers leaned out of their doors, and a group of teenagers across the street slowed their steps to watch. One officer asked for the man's license and registration. Without a word, the rider reached into his jacket and handed over a neat stack of documents. His hands were steady, his movements calm. The officers glanced at the papers, and though everything seemed fine, they weren't satisfied. The younger officer asked where he was going and what business he had in town. The man looked at him for a moment and replied in a low, steady voice, "Just passing through." There was something in the way he spoke, short, simple, yet filled with confidence. It wasn't arrogance, but it also wasn't the voice of someone who felt the need to explain himself too much. The officers exchanged looks. Instead of letting him go, they continued with more questions. Where did he come from? Why this route? Did he know anyone in the town? The man answered briefly, never showing anger or frustration. But his silence in between the answers made the officers uneasy, as if they were missing something important about him. By now, a small crowd had formed. A mother holding her child stopped to watch, and two older men sitting on a bench nearby leaned forward with interest. One whispered to the other, "Doesn't he look like one of those military boys? The way he sits, the way he talks, he's not ordinary." The other nodded but kept his voice low. The police, however, weren't listening to the whispers. They felt a strange sense of authority over the situation and didn't want to let it go so easily. The senior officer stepped closer and said, "You don't seem to be in a hurry. Anything you want to tell us?" The rider raised his head slightly, his eyes calm but sharp. "I suggest you double-check before asking more," he said softly. His words weren't a threat, but there was weight in them. It was the kind of tone that made people pause. The officers, however, brushed it off, assuming he was just trying to sound mysterious. As the minutes stretched on, the crowd grew. People whispered, some amused, some worried. The rider remained still on his bike like a statue. He didn't fidget, didn't argue, and didn't show any sign of nervousness. This quietness unsettled the officers more than anything else. Most people stopped by the police would either argue, plead, or show signs of fear. But this man was different. He looked as though he had been through situations far more serious than this. The sun beat down on the street, and the air was heavy with anticipation. The longer the stop lasted, the stranger it felt. Nobody knew what was about to happen, but everyone sensed that the rider was not who he seemed. Something about his presence carried weight, like a story waiting to be told. The younger officer tried again, raising his voice slightly this time. "Why don't you just tell us clearly what you're doing here?" The man looked at him for a long moment and then spoke with the same calmness as before. "I'm not hiding anything, but you've stopped the wrong bike." The words hung in the air like a quiet bell. People in the crowd shifted, exchanging puzzled looks. What did he mean by that? The officers frowned, unsure if he was mocking them or trying to confuse them. But the rider didn't say another word. He simply adjusted his gloves, rested his hands on the handlebars, and waited. There was something unsettling about his patience. It was as if he knew something was coming, as if he had already predicted how this moment would unfold. The officers didn't notice, but a few people in the crowd did. They whispered to each other, wondering if he was someone important. A man at the back muttered, "Mark my words, this is no ordinary traveler, you can see it in his eyes." Minutes ticked by. The officers, frustrated but unwilling to admit defeat, held on to the man's documents longer than needed. But the crowd sensed the air shifting. The rider's calm words, "You've stopped the wrong bike," echoed in everyone's mind. Nobody understood it yet, but a strange tension settled over the street. And then, in the distance, the faint rumble of engines could be heard. The sound of engines in the distance was faint at first, just a low vibration that could have been mistaken for trucks on the highway. But as the minutes passed, it grew louder, stronger and deeper, like a wave rolling toward the town. People on the street paused and turned their heads. The crowd that had gathered around the stopped motorcycle shifted uneasily. Something was coming. The police officers, however, tried to ignore the growing noise. They were still focused on the rider, who sat motionless on his bike, watching them with calm eyes. His face showed no surprise, no nervousness. It was almost as if he had been expecting the sound all along. The words he had spoken earlier, "You've stopped the wrong bike," suddenly returned to everyone's mind. The rumble grew closer, and now it was impossible to ignore. The ground itself seemed to tremble slightly. A few children in the crowd covered their ears as the noise thickened in the air. The older officer frowned, trying to act unfazed, but the younger one shifted nervously. "What's that sound?" he muttered under his breath. The rider didn't answer. He didn't need to. His steady posture on the motorcycle told the crowd that he already knew. Moments later, the first vehicle came into view. A large tan-colored Humvee rolled into the street, its heavy tires gripping the pavement. Behind it, another followed, and then another. One after another, the vehicles appeared, forming a line that stretched farther than the eye could see. Within minutes, the entire street was filled with the roar of military engines. People gasped, stepping back to the sidewalks to make room as the convoy surrounded the area. 50 soldiers dressed in uniform rode in those vehicles. Their presence was not casual. It was organized, sharp, and commanding. The doors of the Humvees opened almost at once, and disciplined boots hit the ground in unison. The soldiers moved with precision, forming a protective circle around the area where the rider sat. The crowd, once buzzing with curiosity, fell completely silent. No one dared to whisper now. The air was heavy, charged with tension, but also with respect. It was clear to everyone that this was no ordinary man on a motorcycle. At the front of the formation stepped out a tall captain. His posture was firm, his uniform neat, his eyes sharp. He carried himself with the authority of a leader who had commanded men in difficult places. He didn't rush or show anger. He walked calmly but directly toward the officers, his boots clicking against the pavement. The younger officer swallowed hard, realizing the situation had suddenly shifted beyond his control. The older officer tried to stand his ground, but even he couldn't hide the nervousness in his eyes. The sight of so many soldiers moving in perfect discipline made it clear they were dealing with someone important, someone who wasn't standing there alone. The captain stopped a few steps away from the motorcycle. He didn't look at the crowd, and he didn't look at the rider just yet. His eyes went straight to the two police officers. His voice when he spoke was calm but carried weight, strong enough for everyone around to hear. "Why have you detained my soldier?" The crowd reacted instantly with murmurs, shock rippling through the people. The whispers were no longer guesses, the truth was revealed. The man on the motorcycle wasn't just any traveler. He was a soldier, and not just any soldier. He was someone who commanded respect, someone whose presence had drawn 50 men to his side in an instant. The officers froze, their faces drained of confidence. They looked at each other, unsure of what to say. The documents in the senior officer's hands suddenly felt like evidence of their mistake. He stammered, trying to explain. We were just doing a routine check. Nothing more." The captain's eyes narrowed slightly. He didn't raise his voice, but his words struck hard. "Routine checks don't last this long. Routine checks don't draw unnecessary questions. My soldier gave you his papers. That should have been enough." The rider finally lifted his head fully, meeting the captain's gaze for the first time. There was a silent exchange between them, a look of understanding and respect. The rider hadn't asked for help, but the soldiers had come anyway. That bond, that loyalty, was visible to everyone watching. The younger officer's hands trembled slightly as he handed back the documents. We didn't mean any harm," he said quietly, his earlier confidence completely gone. The captain didn't move closer. He stood his ground, but the authority in his presence made it feel as if the space belonged to him now. "Respect is not optional," he said firmly, "especially for those who serve this country." The crowd, still silent, seemed to agree. Many nodded, some with admiration in their eyes. It was rare to see such loyalty, such discipline displayed so openly in the middle of an ordinary town street. The rider took his documents back and placed them calmly into his jacket. He didn't show anger. He didn't boast. He simply remained composed, as if none of this surprised him. His patience and calmness made the moment even more powerful. The soldiers remained still, their formation unbroken. They weren't threatening the officers, but their very presence was enough to send a message. These men weren't just following orders. They were standing in defense of someone they deeply respected. For the first time since the stop began, the police officers realized just how wrong their assumptions had been. They had looked at the rider and seen only a quiet man on an old motorcycle. They hadn't seen the discipline in his posture, the weight in his silence, the story behind his eyes. Now, surrounded by 50 soldiers and confronted by a captain, they understood the truth. The crowd slowly began to breathe again, but no one dared to leave. Everyone wanted to witness how this moment would end. The rider, the officers, the captain, and the soldiers stood locked in a scene that none of them would ever forget. The engines of the Humvees continued to rumble softly in the background, a reminder of the power that had arrived in just minutes. The officer who had first signaled the stop lowered his gaze, embarrassed. The younger one shuffled his feet nervously, clearly regretting his earlier questions. But the rider simply adjusted his gloves and sat silently on his bike, waiting. His calmness was still unshaken, as if he had already known that all of this would happen exactly the way it did. The tension on the street was thick, but it was no longer the uneasy tension of suspicion. It had transformed into a heavy respect. Respect for the soldier on the bike. Respect for the loyalty of the men who had arrived for him. Respect for the captain who stood firm, speaking with dignity instead of anger. And though the officers didn't know it yet, this was only the beginning of the lesson they were about to learn. The engines of the Humvees rumbled steadily, their sound filling every corner of the street. Dust swirled in the air where the heavy tires had rolled, and the sunlight glinted off the soldiers' uniforms. The crowd, frozen in awe, still couldn't believe what they were seeing. What had started as an ordinary traffic stop had turned into something extraordinary. The captain stood tall, his eyes locked on the two officers, but the silence that followed was broken, not by him, but by the whispers of the townspeople. A young boy tugged on his father's sleeve and asked, "Dad, who is he? Why are the soldiers here for him?" The father shook his head slowly, unable to answer. Nobody knew exactly who the rider was, but everyone could see now that he was someone important. The officers, pale and nervous, tried to hold on to whatever authority they thought they still had. The senior one cleared his throat and said, "This is unnecessary. We were just doing our job. There's no need for all of this." His voice lacked strength, and even he seemed unsure of his own words. The captain finally turned his head toward the rider. The man on the motorcycle met his gaze and gave a small nod as if to say, "I'm fine. Let them handle it." The captain's expression softened slightly, but he returned his attention to the officers. "Your job," he said firmly, "is to serve and protect the people, not to harass them without reason." The younger officer fumbled with his belt nervously. He wanted to speak but couldn't find the right words. He had never been in a situation like this before. He had thought it would be a simple stop, just a way to look busy on a slow day. But now, standing before 50 disciplined soldiers, he realized the weight of his mistake. The soldiers remained silent, their eyes forward, their formation unbroken. Their discipline alone was intimidating. They didn't need to raise their voices or show aggression. Their stillness, their readiness, said more than words ever could. Every person in the crowd understood that these men were prepared to defend the rider if necessary. Suddenly the rider spoke, his voice calm but steady. "I told you earlier. You stopped the wrong bike." His words carried across the silent street, and though he spoke gently, the meaning was clear. The officers had made a mistake, and now the entire town was witness to it. The captain gave a slight gesture with his hand, and immediately 2 soldiers stepped forward, not aggressively but with firm precision. They stood at the rider's side, a silent show of support. It wasn't that he needed protection. His calmness proved he could handle himself, but it was about respect. He wasn't standing there alone. The senior officer finally gave in, his pride crumbling under the weight of the moment. He extended the rider's documents back to him, his hand trembling slightly. "Here," he muttered, "everything's fine. You can go." But the rider didn't reach for the papers right away. Instead, he looked at the officer with steady eyes. "It was never about the papers," he said softly. "It's about respect. You should remember that." The crowd murmured again, many nodding in agreement. Ordinary people, who often felt small when facing authority, suddenly saw a man who stood tall without raising his voice. His calmness spoke louder than anger ever could. The captain took 1 step closer to the officers. His voice was even, but there was no mistaking the seriousness in it. "Next time you stop someone, look closer. Don't judge by appearances. You may think it's just a man on a bike, but every person carries a story you don't see." The younger officer finally lowered his head. He couldn't meet the captain's eyes. He knew the lesson was meant for him as much as for his partner. Meanwhile, the soldiers at the edge of the formation scanned the area carefully. Their eyes moved from the crowd to the rooftops and back, not out of fear but out of habit. These were men trained to watch, to guard, to be alert in any situation. Even here in a small town street, their discipline never slipped. The rider finally reached out and took his documents. He placed them back into his jacket with slow, deliberate movements. Then, he adjusted his gloves and gripped the handlebars of his motorcycle. For a moment, he didn't start the engine. He simply sat, looking straight ahead, while the crowd held its breath. The captain gave him another nod, a silent exchange of trust. Then, without needing to say a word, the soldiers began to step back toward their Humvees, moving with the same perfect coordination with which they had arrived. Boots hit the pavement in unison, doors closed with sharp clicks, and engines roared louder as the convoy prepared to move. The crowd still hadn't moved. They were too caught up in the power of the moment. Many of them would remember this day for the rest of their lives. Some would tell their children about the time 50 soldiers rolled into their town to stand by a man on an old motorcycle. The rider finally turned the key, and the engine of his bike rumbled to life. It wasn't loud compared to the Humvees, but in that moment, it felt like the strongest sound on the street. Slowly, he rolled forward, the soldiers clearing the way as the convoy moved in sync with him. The captain walked a few steps alongside the bike before stopping, his eyes following the rider as he passed. As the motorcycle began to move through the street, the townspeople stepped aside, creating a clear path. Nobody spoke. Nobody dared to break the silence. They simply watched with respect as the rider and his convoy of soldiers rolled away. The 2 officers remained frozen where they stood, their faces heavy with embarrassment. They had been so sure of themselves earlier, confident in their authority. Now stripped of that pride, they were left standing in the middle of the street, watched by a crowd that no longer admired them. Instead, the respect of the people had shifted to the man on the bike and the loyalty of those who had come for him. The sun began to lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the street as the convoy disappeared down the road. The last Humvee rumbled past, leaving behind a silence that seemed louder than the engines had been. Slowly, the townspeople began to move again, but their conversations were hushed. They didn't want to break the memory too quickly. For the rider, it had been nothing more than a pause in his journey. For the officers, it had been a lesson they would never forget. And for the people who had stood and watched, it was a story they would carry forever, a reminder that respect is not about power or uniforms, but about recognizing the strength and dignity in every person. That day, the quiet town had witnessed something rare: the loyalty of soldiers, the calm strength of a man, and the reminder that sometimes appearances hide the greatest truths. And though the dust from the Humvees slowly settled back onto the road, the weight of that moment would linger in the hearts of everyone who had seen it. The convoy slowed as the rider pulled his motorcycle to a stop once more, just a little ahead on the same street. The soldiers halted with him, their Humvees lined like protective walls on either side of the road. The crowd, still frozen in awe, didn't scatter. They stayed where they were, waiting, sensing that something more was about to happen. The rider switched off his bike and stood quietly, his boots steady on the ground. The air seemed heavier than before, filled with a silence so deep that even the wind felt absent. People leaned closer, though none dared step too near. They wanted answers. They wanted to know who this man really was. The captain stepped forward again. His presence alone commanded attention. He didn't raise his voice, but when he spoke, every word reached the ears of the officers, the soldiers, and the townsfolk alike. "You've questioned a man you don't understand," the captain began, his voice steady and strong. "This isn't just another rider passing through your town. This man has carried more weight on his shoulders than most could ever imagine. He has stood in places where silence meant danger, where every step could be the last. He has given years of his life to protect people who will never even know his name." The people in the crowd leaned in, their eyes wide. Whispers spread like sparks. Words like soldier, hero, and service floated from one side to another. The rider remained still, his eyes on the ground. He didn't bask in the attention or try to explain himself. He had never wanted recognition, but the captain wasn't about to let his story go unseen. "This man," the captain continued, turning his eyes to the officers, "is a decorated soldier. He's been on missions that will never be written about in books or shown in the news, missions that kept danger away from the lives of ordinary people. He's returned home not to fame, not to parades, but quietly, choosing to ride alone without drawing attention to who he is. And yet here he stands, treated as if he were a stranger with no worth." The younger officer's face burned with shame. His earlier suspicion now felt foolish. He couldn't look the rider in the eye. The older officer, stiff and pale, shifted uncomfortably. The weight of the captain's words pressed down on both of them. The captain's voice grew firmer. "Respect is not something you give only to the ones you recognize. Respect is something you owe every man and woman, because you don't know their battles. You don't know their scars. And when you disrespect one who has given everything for this country, you shame not only yourself but the very uniform you wear." The crowd was silent, but their silence was not empty. It was filled with deep admiration for the rider and the soldiers who stood behind him. Some people's eyes glistened with emotion. A shopkeeper wiped his hands on his apron, whispering, "All this time I thought he was just another traveler. I had no idea." Finally, the captain turned to the rider, his voice softening. "You didn't ask for this. You didn't call us. But you should know you're never alone. Not after everything you've given. Your brothers stand with you." The rider finally lifted his head. His eyes met the captain's, and for a brief moment a quiet understanding passed between them. It wasn't gratitude in words, but in silence, a bond only those who had shared the same path could understand. The soldiers in the convoy remained perfectly still, but their presence spoke louder than any shout could. They weren't just there for display. They were there because loyalty runs deeper than distance, and respect is not a choice for them. It's a duty. The crowd began to murmur again. Some were ashamed for having doubted the rider earlier, while others were filled with pride that someone of such honor had passed through their small town. Children looked at him with wide eyes, whispering questions to their parents about what it meant to be a soldier. Parents struggled to explain, knowing that no words could truly describe the sacrifices he had made. The younger officer finally found the courage to speak, his voice small and trembling. We didn't know," he said almost apologetically. The captain's sharp eyes turned toward him. "That is exactly the point," he replied firmly. "You didn't know. And that's why you must treat every person with dignity, because behind every quiet face there may be a story greater than you can imagine." The rider, still calm, finally spoke. His voice was low, but it carried weight. "I'm not here to be praised. I only ask to be treated as a man, no different from anyone else. But when respect is denied, it's not just me you offend. It's all those who stood beside me, those who didn't make it back." His words sank deep into the hearts of everyone listening. A heavy silence followed. Even the soldiers seemed to stand taller at the reminder of those who had sacrificed their lives. The captain gave a final glance at the officers, his expression leaving no room for argument. "Learn from this," he said, "because one mistake made in ignorance can echo far louder than you realize." The officers nodded quietly, their faces solemn. There was nothing more they could say. The rider placed his helmet on slowly, the black visor hiding his face once again. He kicked the stand of his motorcycle back and prepared to ride. The captain stepped aside, offering him the space he needed. As the rider started the engine, the soldiers climbed back into their Humvees. The convoy prepared to move once more, their engines roaring to life in perfect rhythm. The sight was overwhelming, not because of the machines themselves, but because of the unity, the loyalty, and the respect they represented. The motorcycle rolled forward and the convoy moved with it, a living shield around the man who had asked for nothing, yet received everything from those who knew his worth. The townspeople stepped back, some with tears in their eyes, others with a newfound sense of respect burning in their hearts. The rider didn't look back. He didn't wave. He didn't need to. His silence was more powerful than any gesture. The people would remember his calm strength, his patience, and the loyalty that had surrounded him when it mattered most. As the convoy disappeared beyond the street, the crowd finally began to breathe again. Conversations returned, but now they were filled with awe, not curiosity. Parents told their children they had just witnessed something rare. Old men nodded to each other, agreeing that the lesson of respect had been delivered without anger, without violence, only with truth and dignity. The two officers stood alone, feeling the weight of their mistake. They had stopped the wrong bike, yes, but in doing so, they had also been taught a lesson they would never forget. That evening, when the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the town, people still talked about the moment. Some said it felt like a movie, others like a dream. But for everyone who was there, it was real and it was unforgettable. The street was quiet now, but the memory of what had happened lingered in every corner. The rider's motorcycle had disappeared down the road, and the convoy of soldiers had followed him, leaving only the two police officers and a slowly dispersing crowd behind. For the people of the town, it was as if time had shifted. The ordinary day they had begun with was now forever marked by an extraordinary lesson. The officers stood still for a long moment, their faces pale and thoughtful. The senior officer rubbed his temples, realizing how wrong they had been in judging the man on the motorcycle. The younger officer looked down at the pavement, ashamed that their assumptions had caused unnecessary tension. It was a moment of reflection neither would forget. They had learned that authority is not just about power, it's about judgment, fairness, and respect. The townspeople gradually returned to their daily routines, but the energy of the event lingered. Shopkeepers continued sweeping their sidewalks, children resumed their games, and pedestrians walked along the street. But no one could forget the sight of 50 soldiers arriving in perfect order to support a single man. Conversations were quieter now, filled with admiration and curiosity. People wondered who the rider really was, and though many didn't know the details, they could sense the truth. This was a man of honor, a person whose presence carried immense weight. The rider himself was far ahead by this point, moving steadily along the road. He didn't glance back. His focus was calm and deliberate, as though he had expected the events of the afternoon to unfold exactly this way. The soldiers remained with him, their Humvees forming a protective shield, not because they feared danger, but because loyalty demanded it. Every man in that convoy knew the weight of their companion's service, and they honored it silently, without spectacle or need for recognition. As the motorcycle and convoy disappeared from sight, the rider reflected quietly on what had happened. He wasn't seeking gratitude or praise, but he understood that his presence had made an impact. The lesson of respect had been delivered not through confrontation, but through discipline, patience, and the silent strength of those who stood by him. He hoped that the officers and the people who witnessed the event would remember the importance of seeing beyond appearances and valuing every person they met. Back in the town, life slowly returned to normal. People walked past the street where it had all happened, occasionally glancing toward the spot where the officers had stopped the motorcycle. They spoke quietly among themselves, repeating what they had seen. The calmness of the rider, the discipline of the soldiers, the authority of the captain. Even those who had initially questioned what was happening could not deny the extraordinary scene that had unfolded before them. For the police officers, the lesson continued to echo long after the crowd had left. The senior officer, usually confident and sometimes strict, now found himself thinking more carefully about every person he encountered. He realized that judgment without understanding could lead to embarrassment, but more importantly, it could harm the respect he owed to others. The younger officer, too, was changed. He now understood that courage was not always loud or aggressive. Sometimes it was quiet, patient, and measured, as the rider had demonstrated. The townspeople shared the story for weeks afterward. recounting the day when 50 soldiers arrived in Humvees for a single man on a motorcycle. Each telling added a bit more detail, though none could fully capture the dignity and calmness of the rider, or the precision and loyalty of the soldiers who followed him. Parents used it as a lesson for their children, that respect is earned and given freely, and that appearances can be deceiving. Meanwhile, the rider continued on his journey, the weight of his service unseen but deeply felt. He moved through cities and towns, quietly performing his duties, never seeking attention or recognition. Yet the memory of that afternoon stayed with him as well, not for the spectacle but for the reminder that loyalty and discipline could speak louder than words. He knew that respect had been restored and that sometimes a single act of presence could teach more than any speech ever could. As the days passed, those who had witnessed the scene began to notice small changes in themselves. Children who had seen the calm confidence of the rider began to carry themselves with more self-assurance, inspired by the quiet courage they had witnessed. Shopkeepers and neighbors spoke more kindly to one another, reminded that even the smallest interactions deserved patience and understanding. And the police officers, though human and prone to mistakes, carried the lesson with them into every future encounter, never again underestimating the quiet strength of another person. The story spread beyond the town, shared in conversations, remembered in quiet reflection, and told to newcomers as a lesson in humility and respect. It became more than just an event. It became a reminder of the values that matter most: honor, loyalty, patience, and dignity. Everyone who experienced it in person or heard about it later carried a piece of that lesson with them, knowing that ordinary days can suddenly become extraordinary moments when courage and respect meet. The rider, now far away, never sought recognition for the impact he had made. But in towns and streets across the country, people continued to whisper about the day 50 soldiers arrived for one man, and about the calm hero who had reminded them all that appearances can be deceiving. They remembered his quiet strength, the patience in his eyes, and the loyalty of those who stood beside him. As the sun set each evening, casting long shadows over streets, fields, and highways, the memory of that day lived on. People recalled it not just as a spectacle but as a lesson. It reminded them that bravery does not always roar, that respect should be given freely, and that one person's calm presence can inspire many. Even years later, the story was retold. Children grew up hearing it, learning that judgment must be tempered with understanding. Adults remembered it as a day when discipline and loyalty were displayed in its purest form. And though the rider remained quiet and unknown to most, the ripple of his actions continued to touch lives far beyond what anyone could have imagined. The motorcycle, the riders, the soldiers, and the captain became symbols, not of fame, but of something far more important: the power of respect, loyalty, and quiet courage. And in every telling of the story, people remembered that the world is filled with ordinary faces that often hide extraordinary stories. By the time night fell over the town, the streets were empty again. Life returned to its usual rhythm, but the lesson remained. The officers would approach their duties differently. The townspeople would treat strangers with a bit more care. And somewhere on the road, the rider continued his journey, his calmness, discipline, and quiet heroism leaving an invisible mark on every town, street, and person he passed. It was a day that started like any other but ended as a memory that would last a lifetime. A day when courage was shown not through shouting or conflict, but through calm strength, loyalty, and respect. A day that reminded everyone that appearances are often deceiving, and that true honor is found in quiet actions, not in recognition or praise.